Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we unravel the business complexities at the intersection of environmental, social, and governance issues.
I'm Erika Schiller, and I'm joined by my ClimeCo colleagues, Emma Cox and Anna Stablum.
Get ready to explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy.
From climate action to social responsibility, we're here to decode the ESG landscape by interviewing interesting leading figures across the globe that will empower you with actionable insights.
Whether you're a seasoned practitioner or just embarking on your sustainability journey, this podcast is your compass for navigating the future of responsible business practices.
Let's decode ESG together.
Hello, and welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Erika Schiller, and today I'm joined by one of my colleagues, David Prieto. David is the Vice President of Sustainability Advisory at ClimeCo. So he and I work together to help clients understand their carbon impacts, reduce them, and make good decisions to advance sustainability. We are going to have a conversation with Andre de Fontaine. Andre is the Managing Director at the Center for Green Market Activation. And the Center for Green Market Activation is a really interesting organization that I thought our listeners would be interested in learning more about, primarily because they do a lot in the hard-to-decarbonize spaces. They work on book and claim opportunities, developing new markets to drive environmental decision purchases. And we could learn from Andre about the Center for Green Market Activation, why it's needed, and what your goals are, and what you're trying to address. So, Andre, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Erika. Thanks for having me.
So could you share with our listeners about GMA and your goals, what you're trying to address, and where you started from and where you are now?
Sure, happy to do so. The Center for Green Market Activation, or GMA as we call it, was founded in June of 2024. So we're still pretty young as an organization, but many of the folks who work there have been involved in these kinds of issues for some time. And the organization was born, out of a recognition that there's currently some really significant market barriers out there that are preventing investment into new technologies that could decarbonize some of these hard-to-abate sectors. Notably, there are companies out there that have set ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets that are prepared and willing to pay the premium to purchase green goods and services, but just can't right now due to either value chain disconnects where they occupy a layer in the value chain where they just can't access the goods directly, or sometimes it's as simple as geographic constraints where they're prepared to purchase a green good, but it's just not being made in the place where they are located. And so what GMA is attempting to do is to design market-based systems with a whole set of various NGO partners, oftentimes in the form of book and claim systems, and then also aggregate demand amongst a group of forward-leaning companies so that they can buy those attributes in bulk and in turn send a larger demand signal to the market and help producers, give them the confidence to scale more rapidly. As of today, we're active in several different sectors. We really got started in aviation through the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, and that's something that we run in partnership with EDF and the Rocky Mountain Institute. We're also supporting the Aspen Institute on the Zero Emissions Maritime Buyers Alliance, which takes a very similar model as SABA that applies it to maritime. And we're working with the Smart Freight Center on trucking, really focused on heavy-duty trucking. And then in the materials space, which is relatively new for us, we are active in cement and concrete and also chemicals. And in both instances, we're partnering with the Rocky Mountain Institute.
Yeah, I think at ClimeCo, we've overlapped in a few of these areas on renewable fuels, so aviation, trucking, and maritime. We see fuel switching is that first step in trying to decarbonize these heavy transportation sectors. And then we're very active in the cement and hard-to-abate space. So excited to see how the Center for Green Market Activation is expanding into the materials space, because we definitely see the challenges with connecting the supply and the demand. for those very local supply chains. What are some of the challenges that you're finding when you're transitioning from a fuels focus to materials?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, every time you move into a new sector, there's a host of new challenges. I'm glad that we started in aviation because it's a sector that's relatively well placed for book and claim. Number one, in our system through Saba, we're really focused on the end customer being, the corporate traveler or the cargo owner who's shipping goods by air. And in those instances, those types of companies really have no way of decarbonizing their aviation activities, short of reductions in activities, which many of these guys have done, but they've reached the limit of what they can really get away with in terms of video calls, et cetera. But because they're the passengers, they really can't control where the plane is being fueled or with what. And so a book and claim system that gives them access to certificates is very, very convenient. As we move into the material space, there's a couple of things at work that we need to be conscious of. Number one, you always need to understand the decarbonization levers, the technologies that are available to decarbonize those sectors. Secondly, in the material space, what we're finding is that the value chain tends to be a bit longer. There's a lot more complexity, more actors within the value chain. And in many cases, these actors have not thought particularly hard about decarbonization. They haven't had to, much less book and claim. So there's a little bit more education that needs to take place to make sure that everybody is on board and cognizant of the steps needed to make some of these systems work. And then I think another challenge is that in aviation in particular, you do have a very clear split between the scope 1 and the scope 3 attributes. Or the split isn't really so much the issue. I think you have that split in other sectors as well, but it's more around the incentives and who's able to claim the scope 1 versus the scope 3. The airline that is purchasing the fuel, when that fuel is combusted, they can get a scope 1 reduction if they're using sustainable aviation fuel. And then the corporate passenger can get the scope 3 reduction. What this means is that there's two value streams coming from the same barrel of fuel. So there's an incentive for the airline to use the SAF and also an incentive for the corporate traveler to purchase SAF as well. So that creates a couple different value streams that helps these transactions move forward a little bit more clearly. And then lastly, in aviation in particular, SAF is a drop-in fuel. It's chemically identical to regular fuel. And so there's no additional performance risk or anything noticeable about the fuel that might cause people to look at it differently or treat it differently. Whereas in cement and concrete, and I think some of the other materials that are being produced in totally novel ways, they are actually in many cases different materials. Sometimes their performance is actually better, which is great. But sometimes because they're novel, there is a performance risk that needs to be factored into the physical sale of the product. So you strip the environmental attribute out, now it's no longer a green product, but it still may carry performance risk because it's a totally novel product. So you need to think through, is the system incentivizing the uptake of the physical material after you've sold the attribute? That's something we've had to wrestle a little bit more with in cement and concrete relative to the heavy transport sectors.
And David, I'd love to tap you. Could you share a little bit to our listeners, what do we mean by book and claim? And then how is ClimeCo involved in book and claim?
Definitely, Erika and Andre, we're thrilled to have you on the podcast. Book and claim is a chain of custody model that was initially pioneered by renewable energy credits. So that ability of, like Andre described, unbundling or decoupling the environmental benefit of, in the renewable energy credits case, electrons from the physical delivery of those electrons. And all of us in this industry, we've been trying to replicate that model to other sorts of key materials, cement being one, molecules being another. And the benefit of it is that it's flexible compared to other chain of custody models that have perhaps more limitations with more requirements of tracking it across a value chain. And in our experience, a lot of the work we've been doing lately is, first of all, educating our clients with those who are less comfortable with book and claim chain of custody models outside of the electricity space, and articulating the risk management criteria that are required, as well as the value proposition. Because at the end of the day, it's an opportunity to create a new revenue stream, in particular for companies who are in incumbent sectors and have very, very defined supply chains.
That's great. Thanks. And Andre, you mentioned a couple other organizations that you partner with, but can you share a little bit about how your organization is partnering with other initiatives, First Movers Coalition being one of them, and what is the unique role that GMA is playing?
Yeah, we're a pretty small organization ourselves at GMA. We've got about a couple dozen folks on staff. And so we're able to get kind of a multiplier effect when we work closely with other NGOs in particular. And I think that, there's sort of different ways of partnering, obviously. I think on some of these sectors, it really is kind of very, very close work and close partnership together to build the initiative and execute it. So in this case, as I mentioned in Saba, EDF and RMI are co-partners. In trucking, it's Smart Freight Center. And in cement and concrete and chemicals, it's RMI again. So those are kind of like the core partners that are on a day-to-day basis, really helping to execute the work. And then there is, of course, a whole set of additional stakeholders that we interact with that we have, common objectives with. First Movers Coalition is a really great example. They're active in almost all of the same sectors we are, and they're also thinking about this issue from the demand side and working with large companies to get them to make certain commitments to purchase, really, really high performing materials and goods and fuels, high performing on the basis of carbon reduction. It's really kind of thinking through the next level, some of which hasn't been fully commercialized yet. So that's very much in line with the direction that we're going in as well. And FMC does participate in various working groups that we've got set up. So we're always seeking their input on these issues. I think one of the key differences for us is that we are really trying to guide the companies from commitment all the way through to contracting, because we think that that's really how you're ultimately going to be able to move these markets. I think the goals and the commitments that companies are making through organizations like First Movers Coalition, and there are others like that too, are really, really important in terms of big picture signaling. But if you really want to get the fuel producers and the green commodity makers to invest in new production, they really do need bankable contracts, long-term commitments that are legally enforceable with end customers that are prepared to pay. And that's ultimately what we're trying to facilitate through the programs that we manage with our partners at GMA.
Great. So you're trying to get those contractual commitments so that, let's say, an industrial player can make that final investment decision, invest in that new technology, that new application that lowers the footprint of their product, and they know that they have a buyer.
Yeah. And just to give you a recent example, I mean, we did, a couple months ago announce the winner of our first ever trucking RFP. This is a company called Navoya, a startup based in Los Angeles, all electric carrier. And so we've been able to bring to the table a set of 4-year contracts for electric trucking services in a route in Texas. And so in this instance, the carrier is not going to be able to purchase those trucks and implement the services until it has the contract signed with these end customers. And so that's ultimately what we're trying to do is create that confidence and that certainty so that they can go out there, purchase the trucks and get to work.
And Andre, if I can step in, one question that we often have with companies who are more familiar with carbon offsets is, what role do registries play in these more novel transactions that you've been involved with?
Well, registries are really important because ultimately, you're dealing with this commodities, environmental attributes that are intangible in many respects. They have no mass, no taste, no odor, no color. And so the transfer of the attribute needs to come with its own set of systems and processes to make sure that the person buying them is really getting what they agreed to pay for. And importantly, nobody else is getting that same attribute. So registries are very useful because they can track the full chain of custody of the attribute in a very transparent manner. And then you can retire the attribute through the registry as well to make sure that that's not being claimed by another user. And so that is a best practice in these systems. And in aviation and maritime, those are two sectors where there is, through the work that we did with our partners, we're able to develop registries in those sectors. I think there's more work that needs to be done to create registries for these other sectors that we're now getting more active in the materials space.
And so you mentioned the successful delivery of your first trucking RFP and selection. I know that you've done it a couple of times for aviation. As your procurement process, you've gone through multiple rounds. How has it evolved over time?
I think, probably the best place to start in terms of tracking the evolution really is in aviation, because that's the sector where we've had the longest experience. And so our first joint procurement through Saba was in 2022, and it ended up being a pretty small purchase on behalf of 7 or 8 customers for a single year supply of SAF certificates with commercially available technology. Back then, the supplies were just really low. There wasn't much more that you could do. There was only a couple of different SAF producers out there producing relatively low volumes. I think fortunately for everyone, there's a lot more activity. There's a lot more supply. There's more liquidity in the market today. So a couple of years later in 2024, we followed with a multi-year procurement where we purchased, in many instances, not every customer agreed to this, but many did agree to 5-year contracts, which is really, really important for fuel producers because they need to have a steady stream of assured revenue in order to give them confidence to maintain their investments. Single year deals are not sufficient from a bankability and investment perspective. So we were pleased to see that we got these 5-year deals. By and large, again, that was focused on, with one or two exceptions, it was focused on commercially available SAF. Now, what we're working on now is a procurement that's focused specifically on next generation SAF. So things like e-fuels or advanced biofuels. And the explicit intent here is to help get a new production plant to final investment decision. So to really have a significant role in driving new production of very, very high performing SAF. And so that I think is a direction that we'd love to go in with many, if not all of our programs, is to really be able to say, the demand that we were able to organize from these leading corporations was the thing that was able to tip this producer to get into final investment decision, then ultimately commercial operation.
And is this primarily US or are you looking at other markets as well?
We are looking at other markets. We're the systems that we've created, book and claim, of course, one of the key benefits is that you are able to cross geographic barriers. So we see no reason why, it can't be applied all over the world. And the same can be said for demand aggregation. It's not a geographic specific issue. It works out that to date, a lot of the activity in terms of our purchasing through SAF, for example, has been through US focused companies, but we expect that to change over time. We're in the middle of looking into new geographies to make a stronger push into. But certainly from a system design perspective, these are intended to be globally applicable.
Erika, that reminds me, I think, of some of the deals you've shared with me on carbon removals where they start small with the premise of having a longer term partnership. Are there similarities between those deals and the ones Andre described?
Yeah, I think there are definitely players in the carbon markets who want to bring new activities to market and are trying to show those demand signals. So that could be, direct air capture where some, large tech companies are doing pre-purchases and term agreements to have that steady demand signal so that a producer will build their new facility. So there's definitely a mix of folks who are just buying spot on a relatively active voluntary carbon market. But then there are also newer project types and more removals that are needing that term agreement to make those investment decisions and bring new activities and new credits to the marketplace.
I think responding to buyer requests and due diligence takes quite some time. And Andre, we've had clients who've asked us to share a bit more about what are the requirements the GMA has for those who actually participate actively in your buyer alliances.
The companies that join, they sign a membership agreement, and mainly what they're committing to is active participation through our processes. And so we hold monthly meetings. The intent definitely is that we want companies to procure the attributes that result from the RFP. That is not a strict requirement, however, and we have seen companies join buyers alliances and not buy anything because the educational components of being part of this group generate significant enough value. But ultimately, what we do together with these buyers is we co-design the procurement. We take their input into things like the accounting guidance that we develop. We also take their input into questions of registry design. So a lot of this really ends up being kind of a co-creation process. And so that's probably the most important thing that the companies commit to, is to be part of the journey, provide us with their expertise and their input so that we can make sure that the solution ends up working for them. And of course, we'd love for them to participate in the joint procurements and purchase attributes at the end of the process, but that's not required. We can't control it. The competitive process kind of generates what it generates. Sometimes that works for the company, sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time they do participate, but as I mentioned, there's reasons for joining these that go beyond the direct procurement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think being able to de-risk and share lessons learned pre-competitively is really, really helpful. Are we correct to assume that companies can also issue their own RFPs in parallel or separately to the GMA that are interested in procuring these sort of attributes?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's never been our intent to try to, corner the market on environmental attribute transactions. I mean, if we do think that we're helping to develop these markets and provide a catalytic spark, and we do believe that demand aggregation has some pretty significant benefits in terms of delivering that larger market signal. But certainly, if companies want to run their own bilateral transactions, that's great. And we see it happen quite a bit in aviation in particular, but also in cement concrete. We're seeing a number of different pilot and other deals emerge. We hope and we think that companies, and we have seen this in Saba, companies do use some of the tools that we develop, whether it's our sustainability framework or we have a contract template that folks have used. And of course, the SAFC registry that was developed by RMI and EDF, that ends up being a platform that many use to do their own transactions. But, as these markets grow and mature, there's going to be a lot of different ways for folks to buy and sell these attributes. We're one mechanism, but it's certainly understood and natural that companies would want to go out there and do their own bespoke deals.
The more the merrier, right?
Yeah.
I would think that perhaps different definitions of additionality might encourage people to both participate and also go down their own ways. So how do you approach additionality at the GMA?
We approach it with a great deal of deliberation and discussion because it is one of the more tricky topics that we deal with. And I think, David, as you know, there's different ways of looking at additionality. I think the two primary categories are financial additionality and regulatory additionality. We spend more time on regulatory additionality. For us, financial additionality is almost implicit in the work that we do just because we are targeting the hard-to-abate sectors and the criteria that we develop for the types of goods that we're willing to invest in. Typically, they have very high carbon intensity reduction thresholds. And then there's other sustainability safeguards built around that you just can't get at cost parity today, nor in the near-term future. So the financial additionality thing kind of works itself out. Otherwise, it's very difficult systematically to design financial additionality into a book and claim system. It's going to be a lot of project by project differences. On the other hand, regulatory additionality, that one does occupy a lot of time for us just because, different folks have different views on this issue. And also there's so many different regulations and you're often looking not at that particular regulation, but the way that might interact with other legal obligations, requirements in a particular geography. By and large, though, we operate under something that we call the atmospheric benefit principle, which is really to look at this from the perspective of the CO2 emissions and to ask the question, does the intervention that we're helping to organize lead to emissions reductions beyond what would have been otherwise required by law? So that's the fundamental test. And so when you do that, typically what falls out are any kind of direct mandates, volumetric production mandates or a mandated cap on emissions. Those are things that fall out, are typically not compatible with the atmospheric benefit principle. On the other hand, things like tax credits or grants can be compatible because it's still a voluntary decision to build or make that new product. You are just getting effectively a discount on it. There's a lot of stuff that falls in between those two poles, a lot of like market-based mechanisms, emissions trading systems, those are dealt with a little bit more on a case-by-case basis because it will depend sort of on the broader regulatory context that surrounds those initiatives.
We approach additionality in a similar manner, but are there any key differences with the projects ClimeCo has invested in compared to the ones the GMA has?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the carbon space, when we talk about voluntary carbon credits, we at ClimeCo work with the major carbon registries like FARA, Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standard, ACR, and all of those registries. They approach additionality, regulatory additionality, financial additionality in different ways. Some of them approach it at the registry level, but then they also typically have specific requirements for each activity. So if your activity is protecting a forest or planting a new forest, the requirements to prove additionality, like this forest wouldn't have been protected otherwise, or here's how it's threatened, or this replanting was voluntary, no one required them to plant this forest. Those often are done at the specific methodology level, and that's similar to what Andre is saying in that, you look at the specific project. Why do we want to encourage this project? How does it drive climate benefits? And why does it need carbon finance in order to grow?
Yeah, Erika, that was a very interesting point you made. There's also sort of this question of like where or who's responsible for kind of requiring these additionality tests. And I think that there's sort of couple of different schools of thought, that it's either kind of built into the book and claim system or the registry, or it's more at the point of the buyer, the transaction level, that you start to make those demands on additionality. And I think, recognizing the complexity and some of the competing views on this issue, we are seeing more of a movement to keep the registries relatively agnostic on regulatory additionality and use them as a tool to disclose the regulations that are implicated through the transaction, and then leaving it to the buyers to make a determination as to whether or not that meets their needs from an additionality perspective. And so we're seeing a couple registries move in that direction. It makes sense. It does put a bit more pressure on the buyers to make that decision, but that's where the work that we're doing through the buyers lines and some of the guidance that we're developing can be helpful.
That's exciting. I think in my role, it is a challenge when there's no dominant definition of additionality, where we're asked, hey, how do I navigate it when it comes to, for example, a supply chain emission reduction compared to a beyond value chain emission reduction. And at the end of the day, any emission reduction, I think, is positive with the current emission trajectories we're on. But one question for you, Andre, is a common question we get is, when do you unbundle it versus bundle the physical delivery of a low carbon product? And do you navigate those discussions at all? Because there's some participants might be very comfortable marketing and selling their bundled commodity, for example, cement. But that concept of unbundling it to generate this credit, but still selling the physical product in itself, is something that perhaps some people in the audience might struggle with. So how do you educate your audience in those questions?
Yeah. I think our view is that if you can bundle, I mean, when you use the term bundling, what I'm thinking about here is that you're just really selling a green product to a customer that wants to buy it. And the transaction, the ability to kind of directly transfer that physical product from seller to buyer is there. And our view on this is that if you can do that, that's what you should do. It removes a lot of the complexity. It's just a much simpler approach. You don't have to worry about a lot of these other things that we're wondering about in terms of like registries and double counting and regulatory additionality. If you can just buy the product, you should just buy the product. The reason why we've been spending so much time and energy developing book and claim systems is that that's just not possible today for a large chunk of these green commodities and services. And so cement and concrete is a really good example where you've got, for the really, really ambitious decarbonization potential, there's very little of that's being produced today. And it's happening, you have the supply that's highly, highly concentrated, but the demand that's very, very diffuse. And so the only way that you can kind of take advantage of that dynamic is through book and claim, because the cement or the concrete producer just isn't going to be able to ship this product to various parts of the world. It's just too low value of a product, and it's too heavy and too difficult to transport. So book and claim then becomes very important. Now, if you happen to co-locate your production plant right next to an entity that wants to purchase large volumes of this over a long time period, that's amazing. You should do that. And our vision over time, of course, is that these products become more and more ubiquitous, and the need and the imperative for book and claim becomes less and less over time. We don't know, what the trigger for that is going to be. And it could be that book and claim sort of evolves in certain ways before you phase it out completely. We may just find that we're kind of increasing the ambition of the technology that we're trying to purchase, or we're moving into different geographies. I also think different sectors are going to be on different trajectories on this. In sectors like aviation and maritime, where there's truly a value chain barrier, where the cargo owner or the business traveler literally cannot buy SAF, you may see a need for book and claim for a longer period of time just to allow them to take the credit for those investments. Sectors like trucking, where you are seeing electrification continue to pick up steam, and where the end customer really does have the ability to contract directly for those services. And we are seeing projections of cost parity for heavy duty electric trucks, sometime in the next decade or so. That's one where, you could probably see book and claim begin to recede a little bit more rapidly than in some of the other sectors. And in fact, we're starting to look into that a bit more on our side, thinking through how to build physical procurement into our next RFP. So long story short, yes to the physical purchase when you can, but book and claim is there because we recognize that it's seldom possible today, but we hope to get there in the future, at which point you'll need less book and claim.
It sounds in a way like with the renewable energy credit market, there's power purchase agreements and there's virtual power purchase agreements, right? And we're recording this during the version 2 Science-Based Targets Initiative guidance, which seems to be optimistic about these sorts of new novel credit pathways that we're discussing. So what excites you about the future of the GMA and the market?
There's a lot of exciting things happening, but on the technology front, like the investments are continuing. And if you look at a sector like cement and concrete, there's just a lot of open space right now in terms of what the technology pathway is going to be that drives to net zero. Obviously, CCS is going to be really important, but there's a lot of new ways of making the material that could be transformative for the sector. Similarly, in trucking, we're hearing about new trucks that are coming online that are much more efficient, they're cheaper. I think and they're better. They're easier to drive. We're hearing about carriers, the drivers that are fighting to get into the driver's seat of these trucks. So I think it's really exciting to see the technology change that's occurring out there and the role that market-based measures and demand aggregation can play. We've worked with a couple of startup companies that are just so eager to tap into these programs because they see the potential for these types of initiatives to really drive the adoption of these technologies and kind of help them continue to grow and really become those next great companies of the future.
Thank you both for your inputs. As we wrap up, can you share a bit, Andre, about what's coming for the Center of Green Market Activation? What's coming up? What can our listeners anticipate? And how can they get involved?
Definitely. So I'll just try to tick through a few things because we've got quite a bit of things coming up. One, we're discussing this. I know this will come out later, but the COP30 is taking place right now, and that's in Belém. And we launched just recently an opportunity for individual travelers to purchase SAF certificates to address their emissions from the travel to and from COP30. So we think that's pretty exciting because that was often sort of the vulnerability of these large convenings is that, yes, we're trying to solve climate change, but we're also creating a lot of emissions by people kind of flying in and out. So now we have a mechanism to help folks address those emissions. And that's something we think is replicable. We think we can do that for future COPs and other events. And then staying in aviation, another item that I mentioned earlier that we're really excited about is this next gen RFP. We're calling it the next gen RFP because it's targeting the next generation of sustainable aviation fuels to get over some of the scalability and sustainability constraints that we're seeing with fuels currently on the market. So that's something that we hope to be able to share more about early next year. We're sort of in the finalist phase right now in terms of the providers that we're evaluating. And then on trucking, we announced the winner of our first trucking RFP at Climate Week, but we expect to release more details, total volumes, who the purchasing companies are. And importantly, we'll be releasing a white paper that kind of breaks down the project economics and talks in a little bit more detail how book and claim really kind of helped reduce the total cost to the shippers of the electric trucking services. And then from there, we plan to build out the model and look at ways of actually combining physical procurement with book and claim. And this is something that we're working very closely with the Smart Freight Center on. And then on SCOBA, which is the Sustainable Concrete Buyers Alliance, we just launched this alliance at Climate Week, so just a couple of months ago. We're still growing the group. And we have done an RFI, a request for information, to producers to understand a little bit more about the products and technologies that they are bringing to the market, both today and into the future. And that's going to inform the development of a request for proposals that we will run on behalf of the SCOBA members. And that's something that we're targeting for the first quarter of next year, the release of the RFP. So please stay tuned on that. And then chemicals is in a somewhat similar state as cement and concrete, where an initial group of buyers has been assembled, and they are expecting to put out an RFP initially for low emissions ethylene. That's expected in the first half of next year, with ammonia and fertilizer to follow shortly thereafter. So lots to look forward to in the coming months.
That's great. Yeah, 2026 is going to be a big year, and excited to continue to work together and see how we can engage the marketplace and bring more buyers to the table, right? Bring those demand signals.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to ESG Decoded. We hope this episode has inspired you to take action in your own ESG journey, stimulating ideas for partnership and innovation.
New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday morning. Subscribe now on your favorite streaming platform to stay in the loop.
Join the conversation on social media using @ESG Decoded or visit ClimeCo.com for more resources.
Until next time, keep decoding, keep innovating, and keep making a positive impact.